What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality.
Hi, this is Angelo John Lewis for the Diversity and Spirituality Network podcast. In case you're not familiar with us, the Diversity and Spirituality Network is an emerging community of people who are exploring the integration of diversity and spirituality. We all have different opinions as to what that looks like, but for me personally, I see diversity as nothing less than a sacred path in and of itself. I'd like to invite you to rate the podcast on iTunes, which goes a long way to helping us spread the word and to share our message of sacred inclusion. Today, I'm extraordinarily excited to welcome Dani Antman to the podcast. Dani is the author of the recently published book, Wired for God, an internationally known energy worker and interfaith minister based in Santa Barbara, California. Dani Antman has been in the forefront of energy medicine and healing since 1992, when she graduated from the Barbara Brennan School of Healing. Dani was a senior teaching at the School of Non-Dual Healing and Awakening for over 9 years, and has led workshops at the Esalen Institute, La Casa de Maria, the Lionheart Institute for Transpersonal Energy Healing, and she's dedicated to helping others progress in their spiritual path. Dani, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And I will say it's just such a delight to be here. It's so synchronistic because you used to live in this town.
We lived about, a half a block from each other.
And we've no doubt seen one another. We probably know some of the same people. So as they say, there are no accidents. And I'm just delighted to be speaking with you.
And I'm so happy to be here in Lambertville again.
Yeah, it's a great town. Dani, I always like to begin these interviews by asking you a little bit about your own personal religious and spiritual background. I know, for example, you were raised in a culturally Jewish household, but I also know, as you described in your book, that you heard an inner voice as a child. So, if you would, share with me a little bit about your early religious and spiritual background, before you became wired for God.
Yeah. I think my first spiritual experience was actually outside of a church, and I was waiting for the weekend's bride. It was a church that had weddings every weekend, and I loved to see the bride emerge from the limousine and go into the church. And one day, I was with other kids, we followed her in, and I saw Jesus up there. I didn't know it was Jesus, though. I thought there was a tortured, dying man.
How old were you?
Cross, 5 years old. And I was shocked, because I couldn't understand why that image was up high. And I asked my friend, who is that? And she said, that's Jesus. And I said, oh, and the Jews killed him, she said. And my little 5-year-old self was shocked because I knew I was Jewish. I didn't know what Jewish meant, but I couldn't understand why somebody Jewish would have killed this person. And when I asked my mother, I just kind of got a very pat, we're Jewish, we don't worship Jesus, and don't go back to the church kind of answer. So I was very puzzled by that, and I also felt something in my heart towards Jesus, actually, and that's not encouraged in Judaism. And it wasn't until many, many years later, that I really understood that A, Jesus was Jewish, and B, started to understand how religions can either separate people or encourage people towards diversity and unity. But I didn't understand that till much, much, much later. And I think that early experiences, it stuck with me. It really stuck with me. And maybe it's why I became an interfaith minister. I was always very curious about religion.
Well, I also noticed a little snippet in your book that you heard an inner voice as a young...
Yeah, at first, I would say I'm someone who grew up talking to God, but I wouldn't have named it that. It was just beingness that I talked to, and it wasn't again till much later when people name things. So maybe we all have this innate spiritual connection, and we talk to spirit until someone tells us not to.
Yeah.
Or that I was told it was an imaginary friend. Later on, when I opened up in my healing training, I heard that voice again, and it came in the form of guidance as to where to put my hands or things about the person under my hands. And I didn't put the two and two together until I was in my 30s.
Now, you've just started this book tour, and I have a couple of questions to ask you before we get into the actual substance of the book. I wonder if you could share a little bit about what the book tour has taught you about yourself.
One thing it's taught me is I have to stay grounded. I inevitably get pulled over by police people because I'm driving too fast after I do interviews. So I really practice grounding in my body on book tours and when I'm speaking. Because a lot of energy comes through when I do these interviews, and I have to remember stay grounded. Also, it's very interesting to see what part of my story affects people more or less. I've had some interesting things happen, and I'm always interested in what questions people ask.
Yeah, that was my follow-up. Could you share a little about what people you meet? What does it bring out in them?
Like last night I gave a talk, and I had an interesting question about the chords of relationship. I was talking about energy healing, and this particular person was interested in that because she had had a painful breakup. And she wanted to know what happens to these chords we have between each other when you break up with somebody. And so we talked about that for a bit. I don't have to go into...
It's a great question, though.
It's a great question. The short answer is we all have chords, and when we love somebody and they leave us, the chords tear. It's like where you feel like your heart's been torn apart. That's because the chords have torn. And they can be repaired with love if you can get to that place for that person, or they can be repaired by placing them back inside your own heart and not attaching them to the other as much as when you're in a relationship. So that was an unusual question, but I think the book evokes longing in people, and a longing for a spiritual path or a longing for a practice, because I've been so dedicated in my own life to that.
Yeah, and I'm going to put the first of many plugs for the book, Wired for God, and there's a website that's also devoted to it, wiredforgod.com. Because I consider this kind of podcast kind of a companion to the book. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail of it, but wow, when you read the book, you'll come back to the podcast, you'll get even more. At least that's my intent. So, as you know, my thing is diversity and spirituality, so that's kind of the intent of this question. I know you've had an opportunity to study with a variety of teachers, and many of whom are from different cultures. Without getting into the substance of their teaching, I wonder if you could share a little about the different ways that they communicated their teachings to you, communications which in many respects may have been influenced by their native cultures.
Yeah, very much so. I think I'll talk about Swamiji, who I met much later in the book. It's towards, I don't know, maybe I met Swamiji 15 years ago after I had been on a spiritual path. Swamiji was from Rishikesh, India, and very wise being, a being that was familiar with the esoteric paths of all traditions. And actually he studied them, but his English was poor. And also it wasn't poor, it was heavily accented. His English was actually pretty good, but heavily accented. Almost needed a translator at times. And culturally he was very Indian, even though he was very open to all the spiritual paths, he still had a cultural overlay of Indian. And, when an Indian master is teaching, you don't ask questions, you don't interrupt them. Maybe you can ask questions at the end, and he was fond of telling us we were stupid, and we got used to that. And I understand that this is kind of an Indian cultural thing. And he wanted smart questions, and if we didn't do a smart question, we were stupid. It was a little intimidating. Also, in Indian culture, you memorize things. And when he taught his scriptures, the Vedic scriptures, we didn't remember the sentence after he spoke it. We were supposed to remember it and remember the meanings of each word that he translated. It was intimidating. However, when I look at my notes today, he passed about 1.5 years ago. I took really good notes, and the more I read those notes, I understand what he was trying to pound into our brain about being dedicated to practice, and about not being lazy, and about really reading the source scriptures of the tradition you're working in to get the direct transmission from the scripture. Like, learn what the word means, right? Don't just do it in English. So he gave us the Sanskrit meanings of many of the Upanishads, and we were chanting the Upanishads, for instance.
Now, contrast his style, if you would, to another teacher of yours.
Well, Barbara Brennan, my first teacher, was a NASA physicist.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. She used to do stuff with climate, I believe. Go up and whatever they would do.
Whatever they do, right?
But she was very orderly and did demonstrations for us. So anything she taught, she demonstrated. So healing skills were not something that were mental. We would watch her do it and be impressed with the energy of it. It was really palpable. And she believed healing skills could be taught, and she was very rational and linear, so we had steps and handouts. Very different.
Boy, that's interesting. You know, just briefly interweave a little bit about my story. At one point, I was very involved in macrobiotics. I studied macrobiotics, the yin and the yang, the bim and the bam, as my cynical friends sometimes refer to it. And then I went to Japan. And so I was so used to, they would write down these beautiful descriptions on the blackboard, and it made so much sense in a kind of a mental, but they didn't do it that way. The people that there was just like you have to kind of catch the gist of what they're talking about. It was like, in a way, it was a shock.
Swamiji told us his own teacher would only teach something once if you didn't get it. That was it. Can I mention David LaChapelle, who you...
Sure. I'm going to ask you about him later, but go ahead.
He was really different. He also loved all different cultures. And the way he brought diversity in was through chant. And he had guitar, played the guitar, he could sing, and he would bring in different frequencies and energies through the different chants. So there could be a Shalom chant, there could be an Ave Maria chant, there could be a Hindu chant or a Sufi chant. And the energy in the room would change because he brought the vibration in through the music. And I really loved that.
Wow.
Really, really loved that. It's something you feel with your heart.
Yeah, sound, sometimes I think it's a little explored vehicle for transmission. People know about chanting, for example, but it's actually much more to it than that.
Right.
And that would be another conversation.
Yes.
So what I like to do, and I mentioned, I see this interview as a kind of a addendum, if you would, to your book. And I just absorbed it in my way last night, which means to say I didn't read every word, and I want to just put full disclosure on that. So what I like to do in this interview is to invite you to address a number of themes that emerged for me in my reading of your book. So we're going to talk about, this is a little bit dicey, I'm just going to warn you here. So let's talk about the relationship between spirituality and sexuality, and what you've learned about it from your journey.
Right. I think what people most love about sex is that you have a glimpse experience of oneness, that all your senses are involved, and not only the sensual part, which everybody loves because it's, the body is happy, but at the moment of orgasm, you have a moment of pure consciousness, and it's expansive, and then it fades. And it's like a glimpse and a taste of what can happen as the conditioned mind falls away and you drop into that same oneness experience through meditation. So in a way, the highest experience of both sex and spirituality are similar. But with spirituality, you can have the possibility that the experience doesn't fade with self-realization. And all the religions have some form of regulating sexuality, for better or worse. I think the good part of it is that heartbreak and promiscuity harm the subtle body, which I found out through my own experience. I was in my 20s and 30s in the 70s and 80s when, sexuality and women's lib were pretty great for women, and certainly had a large number of experiences, a lot of which ended in heartbreak, unfortunately, and that the heartbreak, more than the sex, harmed my subtle body, weakened the prana of my subtle body. And I didn't know that, so that was something I learned, that, I have like a auric field that's leaking, in a sense, because of previous heartbreak. And I believe I would have gotten sick if I hadn't started doing spiritual practices to help heal that. Also, our endocrine systems are very sensitive. And the endocrine system is both involved in sexuality and spirituality. For unitive consciousness to stabilize, the pineal gland, the pituitary gland have to be functioning well so that you're not burning neurotransmitters with too much heat in the brain, in a sense. And, when you have a happy, active, healthy sexual life, those endocrine systems are working well also.
Now, another thing I want to address, I just read this article in the New York Times. I wish I had it with me, but I don't need to have it with me because it's a familiar theme, and it's actually one that you've unfortunately had to experience. In this New York Times article, they reference a group which is ostensibly about women's empowerment. But when people started really getting into it and figuring out what was going on, it's like the leader was abusing women, to make a long story short. And this is a story that's unfortunately, it's been repeated over and over again. I don't even have to draw a chapter and verse
and
here.
Right now Harvey Weinstein being in.
Oh yes. But specifically the spiritual, you would think here, that's when a person is incredibly vulnerable. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the issue of trust between teacher and student, and how to, as a person, a seeker, is to maintain proper boundaries.
Yeah, I believe the teacher at all costs should maintain proper boundaries, but as you know from my story, that did not happen with me. And it was a tough lesson for me, because when a teacher showers, a spiritual teacher in particular, showers a student with attention and makes them feel special, they light up. It's kind of a human nature reaction. And when they cross the boundary and make sexual advances, it's a very confusing situation, especially if it's an attractive, charismatic teacher, of which there are many. And that did happen to me, and since that time, I've discovered it's very rampant in the spiritual circles, which is really sad. But it's not just about spirituality. I think the Harvey Weinstein incident right now is, and all the women on Facebook writing "Me too, me too, me too," women, that you have never talked about their Me Too incident. So it's really about women empowerment, and standing up for ourselves, whether it's because of a job or because we want spiritual attention or spiritual realization, to really, if we can, defend ourselves, and if we can't, to report it, because so much of it goes unreported.
So let's say you're talking to a younger version of yourself, a Dani Antman who's like 20 years old.
Right.
She's just out in the world, just discovering things, eyes are open. And what advice would you give her, especially related to spiritual teachers?
Yeah, if they're seductive, it's wrong. Basically, they're not honorable and in integrity. That there's nothing you can get from having sex with a teacher that you can not get for yourself through meditation.
Right.
There's no reason for that whatsoever. I wish I wasn't as naive. I was also in an unhappy marriage at the time, and I think I was very vulnerable.
Let's talk about healing crisis. You and I, and probably everyone listening to this podcast, has had a healing crisis of some sort. What can you tell us about what you've learned from healing crisis or learning from dark times? Maybe specifically or just sort of generally?
Right. After you get over the initial shock of being given a diagnosis by Western medicine, which is often shocking, right? Because as soon as you're given a diagnosis, they're confronting you with a lot of treatments that might be quite scary. And that's a whole first phase of having some kind of healing crisis. I think it's really important, again, to empower yourself to research a number of different alternative ways to deal with your healing crisis. I wouldn't even recommend just one, because every illness has its own inherent possible cures. And on the level of healing, I never look at it as allopathic. I always believe it's an opportunity for growth, spiritual growth, personality growth. I never blame the patient. I'd look at it as an opportunity, not blame. And sometimes the opportunity is to receive love and to ask for help. It might be as simple as that you might be a person who never asks for help, and you find yourself in a dependent and a vulnerable position. And
been there.
And then community. You have to receive from your community, and that creates love and connection again in relationship. The different modalities I've explored for myself are acupuncture, homeopathy, sound healing, energy healing, and psychotherapy. And they all have different benefits. And some people are drawn more to one than the other. So I don't think there's any
magic bullet
fits all. But if I were, for instance, dealing with cancer, I would certainly want alternative therapies to support me detoxing from the very toxic cancer treatment that many people have to undergo, like radiation and chemo. I don't personally know whether I would take chemo or not. I probably would, because cancer is so aggressive, but I would also do an equally aggressive alternative program like juicing, nutrition, acupuncture, all these things, energy healing, that would help me keep the energy flowing.
I just love what you said about community. When I formulated the question, I wasn't actually thinking about sickness. I was thinking more in terms of like dark times. And it resonated so much to me because in my life, not that it's an excuse, but I'm an only child. I'm used to doing things myself. And I remember when I lived in a Japanese dojo, I went there. For the first couple of days, everything was hunky-dory. How are you? How are you? Then I got sick, like everybody did. And most people got sick with constipation, which has various meanings which you don't even need to go into. But I found, and I was like kind of a late getting sicker, for better or worse. But what I found in the process of getting sick was that I got all this love and attention which I would not have ordinarily received, what I would probably keep at bay for my protection of my ego.
Right.
So it was very interesting that to hear you name that.
And I've heard people with cancer actually say that they've received more love than they ever thought possible, which is very interesting.
So you also talk about death and dying. You've had some teachers that are close to you that have died, and your parents also. Can you tell me about death and what it's taught you?
It's been such a great teacher for me these past 10 years. The first thing that happened was I had a rather severe car accident coming out of Lambertville going into Princeton. And my car flipped and went off the road, and I was unconscious for most of that until at some point I was conscious and out of my body, above my body, looking down on my body in the car. And I have never had such a sense of calm, peace, open awareness. There was no sense of the personal Dani. There was no sense of where she was going, who she was in the world, what her purpose was. There was simply awareness, and it was peaceful. And then I noticed that the body of Dani was actually talking to a guy in her car who was not in her car when she started her journey. A very weird observation. And when I noticed that, I found myself being pulled into the body. And at that point, I got very fearful and panicky because I didn't know what was going on. And the man in the car had seen the accident and called the ambulance and told me I was in an accident. And at that point, I still didn't know who I was, but I realized I had a body. And my brain wasn't functioning very well. I had a minor concussion. But the awareness of being awareness only has stayed with me. And subsequent to that, I got very involved with the people that have had near-death experiences. And I've heard many, many near-death experience stories. And the common denomination to that is that we're not our body. This is a journey that has started and begun many times. And that we're here to know our Creator. There is a Creator, life, source of all life. People see that as light or as a all-knowing being of some sort that they have known but forgotten about. And everybody here has a purpose, and we don't actually die until we complete our purpose. The people that have had near-death are always sent back because they're not done yet. Either that or they die and we don't hear from them, right? And through the loss of 6 important people in my life, I've had a larger awareness. And I know that angels come, for instance, as somebody's leaving their body. I know that life continues on the other side. It's my personal belief that we have a life review, that we're not punished for things, but that we get to observe our own life and feel how we affected everybody we've ever talked to. That's a common denominator of near-death experience knowledge. So there's no hell, there's no judgment day. We get to observe and discuss it. And see what we want to happen next, what we want to learn next. And it's given me great comfort. And I also believe I'll see my beloveds, including my cat.
There's so much there to react to, but just a very simple one. I too have been in a car accident, but not a major one like you. And I had the sense, looking at my body, who am I? Oh, you really have like a practical sense that you are not your body.
Not your body. This is just a sack of skin.
Yeah.
And when you know that, diversity also takes on, I think, a different flavor, because I believe somehow or some way we chose our life. Whether we're Indian, Black, Chinese, Japanese, we chose our parents and we chose the circumstances we were born into to have diverse experiences.
And I think another piece which might be interesting for people to reflect on that are listening to this, I was blessed by my tutelage with Michio. I never was really I was for a little bit, die-hard diet person. But I remember one thing he said that really stood out for me, which he says, if you think a little bit about death every day, your life will be richer. He said, destroy your barrier between life and death. So I recently lost someone who's very close to me. And I still feel his presence. I mourn. I still mourn. But he's not gone in the totality of what gone meant. And we don't talk about death in this, at least American culture, very much. It's just something we just sort of push.
And it's interesting. We could have this very human grief response, which I certainly did, as well as know that our beloveds are okay. But we grieve because we love.
We're human.
And we're human.
I'm going to move to the Jewish aspect of you. One of the things that really struck me, I just loved it. You talked about the late David LaChapelle, who was an important teacher from you. And when you first met him, or one of the workshops that you did, he told you that he felt that you had a strong connection to God and the Jewish ancestral line. What does that mean to you?
I've been trying to figure that out. Because I grew up reluctantly Jewish. Right? I wasn't educated religiously. I wasn't particularly interested in Judaism, but occasionally I would hear Jewish prayers and they would touch my heart. I had more of a resistance to being Jewish than a longing to be Jewish. And I notoriously dated non-Jewish men, men of every culture. So I don't remember, I think David was one of the first people that kind of recognized this link. And I had an immediate heart-wrenching reaction to hearing that. It brought grief up. So I was curious about that. Why is there so much grief and sadness? And between that time with David and through my subsequent spiritual development, the Jewish theme got louder and louder. And it seems like I was born Jewish to heal a past life that was rather tragic, where I was exiled from my tribe and murdered. And I gradually started to have my own memories and feelings of this. And it was at a time when Jesus was around. I believe I've met him. And it was at a time when I was with the Essenes. And they were a cult of purity. They wanted everything by the letter of the law. And I'm quite certain I broke the rules and was kicked out. That's my memory of it. Tragically, had to leave the tribe, had to leave the family. And I think it made me really angry, because I had a lot of anger come up as I discovered these memories. However, as these memories were released and healed, I began to explore Judaism as an adult. And I even got bat mitzvahed five or so years ago in California with 4 other middle-aged women like me, way after my 13th birthday. And I still wrestle with Judaism today. You have a whole smorgasbord of things to choose from in Judaism, from ultra-Orthodox to Reform to Reconstructionist to Renewal. And that would be from the very religious to the very liberal, you could say. And I gravitate towards the very liberal at this point. I don't find classic religious services very inspiring. And it's hard for me to relate spiritually once you've had oneness experiences to doing things by rote, whether it's a church or a Jewish service. I hear that a lot. But when you get towards Jewish renewal, it's very spirited, and you chant and you sing, and the prayers are explained and they have meaning, and I find that more interesting.
Well, as a follow-up, as a cultural Jew or former cultural Jew, however we're going to characterize you, and maybe I won't characterize you, what has it been like for you to discover the world of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah? Total
love.
Tell me.
As soon as I started reading Kabbalistic texts, I just kind of knew it, The language, which is quite poetic, like if you read the Zohar, it's beautiful language. One of my favorite phrases is the lamp of darkness. Now, how do you hold that? Talking about the great void and spaciousness, the lamp of darkness. So I started reading Kabbalistic texts, and I just loved the map of consciousness of the Tree of Life. It felt familiar. I started to study Hebrew, and the phrases and the Hebrew letters would just stay with me hours and hours afterwards. So I think David LaChapelle was right. My soul gravitates towards the mystical side of Judaism, which is experiential, and it has a path of meditation. It has a path of healing. I've learned Kabbalistic healing. So I do a kind of healing work that uses an embodied form of the Tree of Life to look at life and understand our actions, behaviors, emotions, and beliefs.
Lady, I could talk to you all day, but I have maybe a last question for you before we talk about how people can find you. Sometimes people go through dark lights of the soul, even on a daily basis. confusion arises. It's part of being human. What daily or regular practice do you use to keep yourself grounded, or to use your wonderful phrase, wired for God?
Yeah. I've had a daily meditation practice now for about 15 years, and I mix it up a little bit. I try to be creative for myself so I don't get bored. But I open with a prayer of gratitude, which is now a Hebrew prayer called Moda Ani. And when I connect to something that I'm grateful for, it starts to disperse some of the darkness. And I meditate in the same place every day. I light candles. I say the same opening prayer. And then I feel like I connect to God. And there's always a response in the form of energy for me. I feel light. I see light. I feel like I'm sitting in a shower of presence, you could say. And I do whatever I need in my practice, whether it's breathing or stretching or moving, to open me to remember that presence again. And then, the dark nights are serious. They don't disperse necessarily right away. But the practice allows me to hold it in a way that's productive, so that I'm not running away from it, but I'm allowing it to reveal its intelligence, perhaps.
In a minute, I'm going to tell people how to find you. But what I'd like to do right now is to invite the listener to just take a deep breath. Take a moment to reflect on what you've heard, what Dani has shared with us in this moment. And in your next breath, allow any person that you think might want to hear something through you that you might want to convey, if you wish. And if you don't want to do that, you can just allow that knowledge to expand to your friends, spirits, neighbors, just silently, just for a moment, through the breath, the miracle of the breath. We're just going to have just a few seconds of silence for that to emerge. Very good. Now, Dani, how can people find you?
The easiest way would be to go to wiredforgod.com or DaniAntman.com. DaniAntman. Yes. And I've been doing long-distance healing for many, many years, so I work on Skype as well as the phone. And I have an office in Santa Barbara, which is paradise. And, one of the things I offer to people is a private retreat. I haven't done group retreats yet. I will eventually. But when people are in a dark night of a soul situation, I've worked with them over a period of 3 to 4 days where they come out to gorgeous Santa Barbara. And we spend a lot of time together, and they get quite a few healings. We walk on the beach, and we have nice meals. And it gives a jump start to getting out of a crucial, painful situation. And it's been very helpful for people who have come.
Dani, it's been just a privilege and an honor to speak with you today. And I hope the listeners feel the same. I'm sure that most of them do. And I do want to take a moment to ask you, if you really enjoy the podcast and you like to support them, to consider being a supporter or a patron of the podcast. And you can do that by going to patreon.com, looking for Diversity and Spirituality. For as little as $1 a day, you can be connected. For a little more, you can get behind the scenes, show notes, and various other things that enable you to, in essence, to sponsor the podcast. And I would invite you to just have a wonderful day or evening and to be grounded in knowledge and who you are. And I'll talk to you next time. So be it.